Okay, guys, welcome to day two of Theater of the Street. I'm going to give you kind of a little overview of the history of graffiti and street art that kind of moves us up into the time period that we're talking about this week as well, which is Style Wars, as well as Nathan Glazer's article. So, graffiti really comes from the plural form of the word graffito, meaning little scratch, or graffio, which is scratch. And it's a deliberate mark made by scratching or engraving on a large surface, such as a wall. And graffiti has not always been considered sort of this brash, illegal, controversial topic. Very much so in sort of ancient Egypt and Greece, as well as Italy, you have people expressing themselves through the power of sort of street and graffiti art. So, for example, this is in the modern day Sudan. You have this kind of little winged lion graffiti on the wall here. Pompeii, like I mentioned ever so briefly on Tuesday, has been a really powerful example of graffiti, and mostly because it has been preserved by the explosion of Mount Vesuvius. You might have talked about this in your 151 class, but you have all of these examples of painting as well as graffiti that survive because of this preservation of the city in this very particular way. So there's something like 11,000 examples of graffiti in Pompeii today. And it's kind of interesting to see that scholars have kind of tried to ignore this fact historically. In 1899, you have August Mao saying that people were not doing this consistently. This was not something that they were used to doing, while other scholars are like, that's exactly what they were doing. They were writing their names in the walls. They were participating in sort of graffiti. And so it has been sort of powerful for art historians to kind of study the way that it was fashionable for people to kind of write on the walls of their city in Pompeii, whether that be sort of politically or just kind of in general. Like you kind of see in like, I think about it like high school bathrooms or something. There's even sort of erotic notes, as well as criticisms. So there are so many that I can give you examples of. There were some examples of kind of imagery like boats with oars before the explosion of Mount Vesuvius, or even of gladiators. These are all examples of that in Pompeii. And even ones that kind of tell you information. So, for example, the archaeologists found one recently that actually dates, someone dates kind of this date before um, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius as October 17th. And that actually allows us to get a better idea of when Mount Vesuvius may have erupted. Originally thought to be closer to August, but it was likely closer now to October 17th because this etching kind of survives here and dates itself. So others are very kind of beautiful. They're poems like Nothing Can Last Forever. The moon that while ago was full is now a crescent. Often the ferocious winds change into the lightest breeze. Um, Versus kind of like funnier ones. Sarah, you are not being very nice. Leave me all alone like this. Secundus says hello to his primo, wherever she is. I ask my mistress that you love me. O walls, you held up so much tedious graffiti that I am amazed that you have not already collapsed to ruin. And if anyone does not believe in Venus, they should gaze at my girlfriend. And they get quite a bit more and more graphic as well. Well, here's an example of a like ad for a upper story room. And just saying like Antiochus was here. There's a lot of these sort of examples of people just sort of writing their name and that they were there. This one about pooping. And then finally, some more sexual ones, such as Salatus, the Thracian gladiator is the delight of all the girls. I screwed a lot of girls here. So it My favorite, on April 19th I made bread, which is so random. But it became part of kind of communicating with the city as a whole. It was used to critique political leaders. So this was very popular in ancient Greece, and it's kind of interesting to see that scholars and archaeologists have kind of ignored it historically, just because of our preconceived notions about what graffiti is and sort of vandalizing and private property, that people have not been as interested in studying it, which is part of this larger conversation about graffiti and street art. In Greece, historically, their pots and pottery are considered pieces of early graffiti. Walls were really not something that was shown to be graffitied on as much in kind of ancient Greece. But according to Christina Milnor, if we consider the way the urban landscape was experienced in New York in the 1980s, the graffiti writing can at one level be considered as a war over space. The pot acted in a similar way, having the quality of a message board. So instead, Greeks would kind of use these ancient pieces of pottery to kind of tell stories and ideas. This one being kind of my most favorite example of Greek pottery, which is the Revelers, also known as the Brygos Cup of Wurzburg, which is where it's located, where you have all of these people kind of partying and celebrating and have a good time. And then once you drink the liquid that's in the bowl, you get to the bottom message, which is someone puking from drinking too much. So kind of these silly little stories and anecdotes that are also told on ancient Greek pottery. Other examples, we have kind of the more traditional vandalism type graffiti here. It was quite often, what you see at kind of sites historically is that people were willing to kind of deface them. So if you ever see like an area of a cathedral blocked off, or that people aren't allowed to go up there anymore, usually it's because people are good at vandalizing and like to write their names and things on buildings. And this is the Temple of Poseidon at Cape Sonion in Greece, which has a lot of graffiti on it of people carving their names into the base and the columns. And we're going to look at one here that is right here on the temple, which is what is that Lord Byron actually etched his name into the wall here. So you can see all these different people that have etched their name. And even you had sort of these very famous poets doing this as well in the 19th century. We have another individual named Brassai, who became a very popular photographer in Paris in the 1930s. His photographs are very important for kind of photographing these gritty, dark images of the Paris streets kind of at night. And something that he did that actually really helped us to understand graffiti a lot, because graffiti is very ephemeral, often is destroyed or removed quite quickly. That includes kind of subway cars as well, and we'll talk about that. But Brassai went through the cities and photographed the cities, including graffiti as well. So he became kind of fascinated with the graffiti of the city, and did a whole series of them from the 30s to the 60s. And he really kind of thought about them as this childlike art, very much connected with surrealism and Andre Breton. When photographing in the streets, Brassai treated the graffiti he came across as found objects, respecting the original creators, but at the same time using his judgment to make selection, choosing only those he considered to be a formal success. He often isolated one singular carving or scrawl, photographing it up close, emphasizing its individual detail. And so it was kind of this freedom and energy that is lost when it kind of gets removed historically, that he was able to capture in this photographic series. He also wrote extensively about this subject, referencing cave painting and highlighting the difference between the use of a wall as opposed to a different material, and really was very interested in investigating why people would kind of write on walls. And you could understand how that would be part of surrealism, and that like surrealism is about the unconscious and the subconscious and connecting with this sort of intrinsic ideas within yourself that maybe like graffiti on a wall is kind of like an outburst of that energy. And it's really interesting to see kind of what he chose to photograph. A lot of these kind of really cryptic, weird faces very much kind of connect with this like alienation of the city, which is very much part of like the artistic nature of the 1930s to 60s, and thinking about like the alienation of the cityscape. And so it's interesting to think about like what he did or didn't capture in making his sort of photographic series. I saw this interesting article that was called "Is Graffiti the Social Media of the City?" Versailles photos showed the secret to rebuilding community, which talked about very much that Versailles paid greater attention to political markings, and he believed that graffiti was a way to read the city, and that was language native to the city, unfiltered by elites. His photographs stand out as visual bookmarks. In the age of social media, shared experience is increasingly disconnected from physical proximity. There are no commons to facilitate mutual understanding. Graffiti almost uniquely bursts through the filter bubble to show us what other people think. And the writing on the wall became in photographing it, Versailles has done his civic duty. Of course, Versailles very much kind of becomes part of the elite in that he's connected with surrealism, as well as he is not photographing every piece of street art he sees. So he's definitely taking his own sort of artistic liberties. But I think it's an interesting idea and construct on its own. Other early graffiti, such as in World War II, Kilroy was here, if you've heard of this one before. In the Second World War, these messages were being written around where the soldiers were traveling, the US soldiers, as well as sort of internationally eventually. And we have no really great idea of who started it or who first wrote it, but it became this kind of symbol of the American servicemen, and humanized these kind of barbaric situations for people and made them feel like they were connected. So they would see these kind of images around of this weird little funny caricature. And the caricature itself came from this Mr. Chad, which was a British character that makes these sort of jokes like, what? No petrol? What? No exercise? I don't really get the jokes of it, but it comes from this sort of caricature image. Which leads us up to the history of street art. And it's interesting, street art and graffiti is very much connected and intertwining. And some people think of street art as having its own separate history, while others see it as kind of working congruently, or that street art kind of came as a part of graffiti art. So it's hard to say exactly, but we definitely see the kind of intertwining of it historically. And this is kind of a little graph or image that kind of gives you an idea of that. But street art is the heir to graffiti art. It is rooted in the creativity of dislocated and urban communities. Artists taking control and not wanting to be commodified by the traditional sort of art community. There's kind of a motto like own the wall that surrounds you. And obviously they cross over graffiti and street art, but they're very much also connected with their own sort of specific definitions. They come into place by movements like situationalist, pop art, punk, and graffiti, very much about sort of anti-establishment art, as well as sort of using subvertising with the kind of pop art narrative. So there are some famous artists who consider kind of street art. Gerard Slotey-Camion is considered one of the early street art painters, though he very much feels like he is teetering on the edge of street art and graffiti art, because he paints with spray cans and such. And so I think there's definitely like kind of a line here. But his first art was in 1963, in which he drew ghostly silhouettes and called them ephemerales. And they were ephemeral drawings meant to evoke human shadows that were printed on the walls after the explosion at Hiroshima, the nuclear explosion, that is. And so his little kind of ghostly, weird figures come from these photographs that were taken in Japan after the dropping of the nuclear bomb, that he ended up sort of connecting with and feeling sort of this horror of war in general. And this was that the heat from the explosion changed the color of surfaces and kind of made these stains of things that existed there at some point, and the outlines stained into the ground. So they're not like vaporized bodies or vaporized organic material. They're like the imprints of it through the sort of scorching light. It did kill people, obviously, but that's not what the kind of shadows represent. However, it very much kind of feels like that you are connecting with the kind of death of someone's body when they're imprinted on like the steps of the banks of the city, because you know that those people were absolutely killed from the blast because they were so close to it. So Zadie very much kind of connected with this because of this sort of horror and violence of the war, and made his little ephemerales based on this idea and this horror. And they've kind of traveled with him for the last 60 years. Oh, sorry. About this kind of connection with machine future shaped by deep learning, this disturbingness of what was going on in the 1960s. Another famous street artist of this time is Ernest Pignon Ernest. Around 1966, he similarly to the ephemerales, had this distaste with nuclear weaponry and warfare, and he wanted to go into the spaces and connect with them to see different textures and soul in that location. And so he moved to kind of screen printing on paper, very much kind of like pasting paper images, and he liked the deterioration of the images themselves, in this kind of quote unquote death foretold. And so he did a couple different projects. One of the most famous ones is his images of the poet Arthur Rimbaud in 77 to 78. He went from Charlottesville to Paris, posting up screen prints of Rimbaud's portrait along the way to think about the poet's literal journey. He traveled from Charlottesville to Paris, and so Rimbaud posted all of these posters in the kind of path he would have taken to move through these spaces. Rimbaud died at 37 after releasing only one major work of poetry, and Pignon Ernest really thought that works of him in paint, marble, or bronze didn't really do him justice, and there was much more vulnerability to the paper itself. It had this kind of ephemeral quality and fragility, and so he wanted people to have personal reactions to these locations where Arthur Rimbaud would have been, and about this kind of deterioration of that space, which I think is really powerful in its own sort of way. Blake Lerat is also really famous. He is still working today as Xavier Prow, and he's one of the primary pioneers of early stencil graffiti in Paris, and was influenced by graffiti in New York, which we're going to talk about, as well as situationalists. And he took his name from the comic book Blake Leroc, but replaced it with this sort of comedic Blake Lerat, and created all of these stencils of rats in 1981, and put them all over the cities in Paris. And he believed that rats were the only kind of free animal in the city, which speaks to the plague, or spreads plague everywhere, just like street art. And so he became this kind of famous figure in street art because of this. And if it seems vaguely familiar, it's because Banksy is very, very influenced by Blake Lerat in producing images of rats as kind of this caricature of the city that kind of tells you like it is. And he's done a lot of commentary. We're going to talk about him when we talk about Banksy, but commenting on the visibility of homeless individuals in Paris as well as producing images of himself as the traveler. to talk about his own life as well as sort of issues of larger political ideas as well. We also have Dan Witz, who hand painted tiny acrylic hummingbirds into small exterior locations. They're only about 4 inches in size, but would take 2 to 4 hours. He hated New York City exclusive art scene, and so he started creating this little hummingbird tag. And so this became a popular sort of example of his work early in the 70s. And then it kind of transitioned into him playing these little pranks in which he would create optical illusions that something was happening called holes. And he would make them in his studio and then install them. He would like install the whole piece that was supposed to look like a grate. And it was very much about kind of like how much people were paying attention because it was sort of hard to catch these images in these kind of small spaces that kind of look like they were part of the city. Gordon Matta Clark is also considered a street artist, or a very early one, and he was very much part of situationalist canon as well. And he wanted to kind of reroute imagery from mass culture. And his projects usually included buying small plots of land between structures that were impossible to build on, then simply exhibiting the legal papers concerned with the sale. And he got a lot of attention right away in his kind of ephemeral work. And it kind of led to this architecture, which he would make commentaries and spatial compositions like this house. And so, for example, this is Splitting from 74, where he commented on these kind of simple gestures of space, where he famously split buildings down the middle and left it like this for people to kind of experience, would take these kind of like deteriorating homes and do this kind of commentary on anarchy and architecture together. He also did one called Hole in New York, Day's End from 78, in which again he was making a commentary on walls and ownership, kind of apt in our political climate, and the commentary on walls. And the police didn't even notice that he'd carved out the wall until the opening of the show, which he got in a lot of trouble. But he was able to carve out this space and make this commentary about kind of ownership as well with this work. So really around the 70s is when we have street art and graffiti art be considered sort of high art, with exhibitions that start occurring that are being put together by sort of everyday individuals. So John Fechner puts on the Detective Show in Gorman Park, in which he sends out these little postcards and uses the first sort of example of this definition of street art, which is using the word street museum, in which people come and display their work in this park. Which then kind of starts this movement towards these kind of shows of more ephemeral work like graffiti and street art at the Times Square show. And this is where you have this first radical movement of art in museums in like the typical artistic community. And a lot of the works were kind of hung in salon style in this carefree fashion, kind of like if you were just to like go in there and like pin it up against the wall. And this is where you have like Keith Haring and Basquiat really making their first appearances on the art scene, as well as Jenny Holzer, Kenny Scharf, Kiki Smith, Dave Hammonds, Lee Quinones, Fab Five Freddy, who we're going to talk about all next week. So this really brings us to the definition of what is graffiti versus street art. And we talked about this kind of last week. But I wanted to give you kind of an overview of how the artistic community kind of defines it. And so how are they different? And there's kind of 4 key components we're going to look at, which are medium, preparation, interaction with audience, and art education background. So Graffiti, almost working exclusively with spray can and marker pens. We talked about this on Tuesday, pushing to see what they are capable of making with just these materials. This changes depending on location. Brazil and other international artists do it a little differently. They're working with many materials in street art. On the other hand, like paint, stencil, posters, stickers, wheat paste, found objects, etc. In preparation, graffiti artists might do some of this, but not usually at great lengths. They're not usually prepping up their works far in advance. Some preparatory sketches, potentially, versus street artists often making their whole work before and putting it up on the street, like stencils, bring closer the studio-based art practice. And then interaction with audience. Graffiti isn't about connecting with the masses. Instead, it's about connecting with different crews. It's an internal secret language. Some graffiti you can't even read, so it's really contained within the culture that understands it. And so this is very kind of early 1970s graffiti, in which they're using kind of tags and language that's not sort of known to the general community. Versus street art wants to connect with the audience of the street and citizens to communicate certain themes and ideas. And then there's this art education background. Graffiti often not involved directly in the high art community versus street more likely to have an art education background. And this is really where I see the most problematic definition of street and graffiti art, because they can definitely overlap exhaustively. But I think that in trying to say that graffiti is not part of the art community versus street being part of the art community is exactly where we have this kind of like, well, graffiti is illegal and an evilness, it's vandalism, versus calling street art art. And so we're going to see this come up all the time in this semester, but this is a problem with kind of defining what you think is better art or worth being seen, when I was talking about like Basquiat and Haring as well. We'll come back to that. So we see works on the street versus works in the museum and how much that changes kind of the narrative. So if you look at something like Banksy, right? Banksy's work on a wall, before he became famous, right, is very much kind of graffiti. He does it quietly, illegally, versus like people were literally cut off pieces and put it in a museum. And then what then is the language of that image, right? How much does it change what Banksy was originally trying to say by moving it into a museum space? And then some similarities, both come into play in public spaces together, both often making a commentary on social and political issues, and both are taken on or over by mainstream art community. So this brings us up to the evolution of graffiti art and where we're kind of making ourselves in to the conversation about Nathan Glazer and Style Wars, into sort of the New York graffiti scene. And graffiti art before 1965 had a lot of links to gang relations and its own history and traditions, but in the 1970s, it really becomes part of the sort of non-gang related community and conversation, and it came less about conversation about property and what territories belong to who, but instead about wanting fame and getting kind of recognized. And so you had all of these artists starting to tag and engage with this city with their names. So in the mid 1960s, we have kind of this tagging of like Taki 183, Tracy 168, Barbara 62, and Eva 62. And this is really comes from where they lived in New York. Taki lived at 183rd Street in Washington Heights, thus Taki 183. And so Taki is one of the first famous ones for tagging their name. So this was very much connecting about the location in New York where you lived, as well as your name, and then putting it all over the city so that people could see all the places you were, right? And the more places you sort of tagged, the more kind of important and powerful you were. There is not only sort of the traditional graffiti, but also scritchiti, which is where people kind of scratch into the glass of the subway cars, which is even more destructive, I would say, than painting, in that you can't really remove the windows as easily as wiping the paint off or cleaning the paint off, theoretically. And then again, we also had wild style. So this sort of great artistic challenge for graffiti writers to have this very difficult writing to read, and people will kind of see how complicated or graphically interesting they could make it. So in the 1970s, tagging evolved quickly into a full movement. From 75 to 79, individuals traveling from the Bronx to Brooklyn and challenging each other, using a free and unique language based on typography, comic books, and pop culture. It was a big part of the iconography of the hip hop culture. And it slowed down in 82, 83 because galleries start taking it on. And so people start getting less interested in doing it in the streets of New York City. And by 1982, graffiti has also traveled to America and Europe and sort of on the scene as well, with Bando being one of those examples. So when we come into next week, we're going to be talking about Nathan Glazer and his work on subway graffiti in New York from 79, which is very much a primary source of that time, in how a lot of people politically, like mayors or police officers, often kind of commented on street and graffiti art at the time and are dealing with some of these sort of complicated topics that I'm discussing. So think about what are the important points of Nathan Glazer makes in his article on subway graffiti art in New York. And what is the point? Why discuss this? Why is he talking about these ideas? And you get a sense of this in Style Wars as well. So make sure to watch that documentary, and we'll talk about those two things together, but because they're very much intertwined and kind of the language of what's going on in the 1970s in New York. So I will talk to you all then.